Thanks very much, Doug. I'd just like to welcome everyone, comrades, friends, brothers and sisters in struggle. Thank you for taking some part of your day to come and protest the continuing war in Afghanistan and our new military intervention in Libya. I really don't have lots to say, and I do have a bad habit of talking a bit too long, so I'm going to try and rectify that today. But taking off from the Raging Grannies, who I thought made a very excellent point in their last song that they sung, the reason I'm here is to protest the dirty business of war. And as the Raging Grannies say, make no mistake about it, war is a business, and war is good for business. In fact, it's one of the few businesses which remains unbroken by the recent credit crisis and the financial crisis, that the war companies, the arms industry, remain powerful and wealthy. And there is a sad fact that war is good for business, and very much a motivating drive of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and now in Libya are because they are good for business. Because the arms industry is never going to be in danger in our kind of society, as a late capitalist society, of going into an overproduction crisis or an under-consumption crisis. Because there is in our NATO organization and the military alliances of which we are a part, there is always going to be a demand for increasing combat jets and for other items in the military and defense budget expenditures. War is good for business, and that is a sad fact of our life until we remove the governments that thrive on war, until we remove the governments that put profits before the human lives and interests of ordinary people. So we know that we've been coming here since 2001 to protest the war in Afghanistan and 2003 in Iraq. And we know why we oppose those wars. We said it so many times. We opposed to those wars because they were wars of aggression. They were illegal, immoral, and unjustified, supreme acts of aggression against the United Nations Charter. And we know that we are also against the wars because of the civilian casualties that they've caused, certainly in Afghanistan as well as Iraq. In fact, we know in the last year that the amount of civilian casualties in Afghanistan has gone up by over 50%. And I have lost count of the number of times that the newspapers have reported on more collateral damage, of more civilian victims of NATO bombing raids. I've lost count of the number of times that Hamid Karzai, who is after all a puppet government of the US, of Washington, of the Washington administration, has cried and wept openly for the civilian casualties of the NATO bombing raids. I've lost count of that. So no question that civilian casualties in Afghanistan continue to climb at a tremendous rate. And that doesn't take either into account those who have been injured and those who have been forced into refugee exile into other countries. The overall desolation and misery for the population of Afghanistan is beyond human counting at the moment, because no proper records have been kept. And we're also against the war in Afghanistan because it's killing Canadians. On the last count, I recall, in January of this year, 155 Canadian soldiers had been killed. But again, that doesn't speak to the number of Canadian soldiers who come back to Canada with catastrophic battlefield injuries, both physical and psychological. And we have yet to try and, in a sense, take reckoning of that account. The number of suicides of returning combat veterans, at least in the United States, there are reliable facts and figures. In Canada, the Department of National Defense maintains that that is a matter of national security. It's a secret. So for these reasons, we are against the war in Afghanistan. We're against it also because of the war crimes which are being committed in our names, over which we have no control. The bombardment of civilian populations, the death of civilian casualties, the renditions, the torture. We know from recent facts from the Pentagon that the prison in Bagram, in the Bagram airspace in Afghanistan, as some survivors who've come out of that prison camp tell us, it makes Guantanamo Bay look like a holiday camp by comparison. And I won't sensationalize the details of what has happened to some people. You can Google that for yourselves. But believe me, we are handing over, as Peggy said, prisoners for the most extreme, violent and sadistic forms of torture that are basically unmanageable. And it's true they may be in combat against Canadian troops, but the Canadian troops should not be there in the first place. And even as enemy combatants, people should still be treated as human beings. So what is being done in our name is unspeakable. And it's our responsibility as citizens to educate ourselves about the atrocities which are being done by the NATO forces at the moment. And then finally, of course, there is the question of destabilization. We oppose the war in Afghanistan because it is destabilizing the entire area. The drone attacks in Pakistan have led to what even the Americans call the Afpak War, the Afghanistan-Pakistan War, in an area where the British colonial authorities never succeeded in making a permanent boundary marker. The Durand Line, which to the Pashtun tribes is not an international boundary. The colonialists tried to make it so. And there is a sense, as Robert Fisk from The Independent, when he interviewed some Taliban commanders, where Robert Fisk was able to show that many of these warriors in Afghanistan believe that the British at least are there to avenge the death of their forefathers, of their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. Because we know that the British tried 3 times in the 19th century to subdue Afghanistan in the Great Game, as it was then called. But the Great Game continues. And I am sure, as the sun rises and sets tonight, that just as the British and their allies failed in the 19th century, they will fail even more miserably today to subdue the country of Afghanistan. So who does profit from the war? Who's making the dough? We know who all the usual suspects are. The arms companies. In the United States, it's Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. In this country, it's McDonnell, Detweiler, Bombardier, SNC, Lavalin, and so on and so forth. These companies are pocketing super profits at the expense of the misery and loss of life of others. But we also know there are many other companies who have their noses in the trough. We know that the construction companies, again the American company Louis Berger and Halliburton, a friend of all of us, these are companies that continue to extort from their own governments in no-bid contracts, and for whom these wars are highly profitable enterprises. We know that the private military and security contractor companies, the old Blackwater, which is now called XE, I think, and Dynacor, and many others, what some journalists refer to as the shadow armies, these tens of thousands of combat forces for NATO and for the United States and the United Kingdom, who are not governed by the Uniform Code of Military Justice, who do not have to worry about the Geneva Conventions, because they are, after all, mercenaries. They are not part of the regular fighting force. And these are people who not only provide close-up security and protection, but they involved in interrogation and also in search and destroy and assassination as well. They work with the CIA and a half a dozen other secret black operations which we know very little about. So these are the many reasons why we have and why we continue to oppose the war in Afghanistan as being an immoral and unlawful and a totally irresponsible and reckless war. So what has been the game plan for NATO, the United States, the European countries who participate in Afghanistan, and for that matter for those, the coalition of the willing in Iraq? Well, the game plan, if we reduce it to a nutshell, we can say is to create client states. To create states which are politically subservient to Washington, and states which are economically dependent upon the huge monopolistic, oligopolistic, economically dependent, because after the military, after the Marines, after the mountain squads go into these countries, then come the large corporations to impose on these countries a neoliberal agenda that we have learned to know so well. Full marketization of all goods and services, privatization of national resources, break up the national infrastructure as they did in Iraq and in Afghanistan, hand it over to the European and the North American capitalist corporations, and then deregulation. Those three evil triplets, if you like: marketization, privatization, deregulation. So this is the game plan, and many of us believe that this is also the game plan for Libya. Libya, in a sense, is the first attempt to intervene militarily against a threat that some of the grassroots uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa potentially pose to the Western countries, to the imperialist and neo-colonial states. So why is it that many of us in the anti-war and social justice movements say no to the no-fly zone? Is it because we don't care about those who may be attacked by the government forces in Libya? Is it because we don't care about loss of life? No. The very reason that we oppose the no-fly zone is because we don't want to contribute to a loss of life. We oppose the no-fly zone because we do not want to extend the militarization of this conflict, of this civil war. We would be happy, and we have always supported, peaceful resolution of these political differences, because history has taught us that there are no military solutions for political conflicts. The Americans fought for how long in Vietnam, and how did it end? It ended around the peace table, after 2 million people had been murdered in the south and 2 more in the north in Vietnam, when the forests had been poisoned and contaminated with Agent Orange and napalm. All of that loss of life, for what? For the peace table, because that's where it ends, and it always does. So we oppose the no-fly zone, the military aggression in Libya, because we don't believe that there is a military solution to a political problem. We believe that the no-fly zones are counterproductive, because no war has ever been won from the air. The Americans learned that in Vietnam. They also learned that in Iraq, that in order to seriously win a war, it requires ground troops. It requires boots on the ground. And so any commitment to a war in Libya will inevitably lead to ground troops. Even Rick Hillier, General Rick Hillier, said that just the other day. I don't agree with what he said, but one thing he did say is that if we simply leave it at no-fly zones, nothing is going to change. Rick Hillier was advocating an escalation of the war with ground troops. And unfortunately, that's where it will lead unless the forces of peace, of negotiation, of mediation, of diplomacy are given a chance. The reason that we oppose the no-fly zone is because it prolongs the civil war and it postpones indefinitely the chances of diplomacy, of a peaceful negotiation of this settlement. So for these reasons, we see the game plan that failed so obviously in Iraq and Afghanistan is going to be, unless we do something about it, implemented again in Libya. And we should ask ourselves, why is it? How could we believe that those who brought us the horror shows of Afghanistan and Iraq will now produce a children's pantomime for us in Libya, where the forces of evil will become overcome by the forces of good and everyone will live happily ever after? You would have to be naive to believe that, because the historical record of these NATO interventions speaks otherwise. And as one philosopher said, those who refuse to learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. And this is not something we want, an indefinite repetition of the mistakes of the past and the loss of life in these war zones. Now is the time, more than ever, to fight for peace and democracy at home and an end to militarism. If you were to ask us, then how can we support the grassroots uprisings, some of those democratic uprisings may be in the Middle East, I would say to you, we can do the best we can by fighting for democracy, peace and social justice in our own country. Because one thing we can do is to try and break the economy of its dependence upon the arms industry and upon militarism as a major force of economic production. We have enough problems in our own backyard. The Council, the Canadian Council Centre for Policy Alternatives recently came out with a document which shows an appalling level of inequality in this country. The top 10% of Canadians own 60% of the wealth and also have 40% of the income. It's worse than the United States, actually, even given the financial crisis. So the time has come to put our own house in order before we start dictating our morality to other countries. If we want to support movements for peace and social justice and democracy in other countries, we should begin in our own country to break the connection between economics and warfare. That's where we should begin, I think. So, what is the price we pay until we do that? The price is inequality at home, is militarism, is an economy driven by militarism. Another price is secrecy, a government which still doesn't want to tell us the truth about the rendition and passing of detainees to the torture authorities in Afghanistan. It's a government which still is trying to prevent the testimony of Richard Colvin from being entered into the documents of the Military Commission's report. Secrecy comes hand in hand with war overseas. That tyranny overseas breeds repression at home. And our latest example of that, I suppose, is how the government treated the G20 protesters in Toronto the other day. And that, in many senses, is only the beginning. We will see more of that, particularly if Harper comes into a majority government. So, in conclusion then, I see the NATO forces and the United States and the European countries right now in NATO, they see themselves as representing what they feel are masters of the universe. They have a monopoly of arms, they control most of the world's economy. We stand for something different. We stand for the citizens of the world. We represent the global citizenry at the moment. We don't pick and choose which countries we want to support democracy. We don't say, no, the Palestinians can't elect who they want, or no, we don't allow the Haitian government to elect Aristide because we will take him away. We don't pick and choose. We try to remain consistent. We are consistently in favour of peace and social justice, and we should take control of our own country. Thank you very much.